Welcome to the NYC Trans Oral History Project and Rethinking Oral History Methodology, the final event in the fall season of this year's Oral History Workshop Series, Oral History and Power. But we'll be back in the spring, so keep an eye out for that announcement and hope to see some of you there as well. My name is Carlin Liuzia, and I help to coordinate the series alongside Amy Staracheski. And I also instruct the accompanying course here in the Oral History MA program. I am joining you all today from the unceded lands of the Chochenyo and Ohlone people, many of whose descendants still live in this sphere of the San Francisco Bay Area. And many of these folks are still living here, still resisting assimilation, still working to rebuild the relationships between this land and the people who live here. If anyone, I can't quite see the chat right now, but if anyone else is around where I am, I encourage you to check out the work of the Sogore Te Land Trust, which is an organization here in the Bay Area. As I did last time we were together, I'll put OMA's formal land acknowledgement in the chat, including some of the core resources that we as a program have been learning from, in particular about our field of oral history. But rather than reading that out, again, I wanted to share a small story, and I'm hoping not to take too much of your time, Michelle. But I've been reflecting, sort of coming up on this last event. When I was a student in OMA 3 years ago, my classmate Valerie Fent invited me to an event that was happening that evening in some Columbia building I'd never been to. And I sounded great, and I really trust Valerie and her recommendations, so didn't hesitate to tag along. The conference room was packed when we arrived, but we were able to squeeze into some standing room, I think by the snacks. And I know that I have somewhere in some notebook, like a 2-page full spread of scribbles and exclamation points and underlines from that event. But that's in New York and I'm in California, and I don't know anything more about the event. I can't tell you who was speaking. It was this amazing Indigenous scholar. I can't tell you what in particular she was talking about. But what I remember is that at the beginning of her presentation, this was 3 years ago, at the beginning of her presentation, she said that she'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And she asked if anyone in the room could tell her whose land we were on so she could honor them. And it was crickets. Like, nobody said anything. There was some rustling, we looked around at each other. And the rest is fuzzy to me. Like, I don't, someone may or may not have sort of eventually piped up that we were on the land of the Lenape people. Someone might have looked it up on their phone. Valerie and I remember we made eye contact, and for those of you who know Valerie may have a sense of this, but I can't remember. She may or may not have whispered an expletive in my ear and shaken her head. And I share that story because I can't remember an event I've attended recently that didn't start with a land acknowledgement. And I'm not quite sure when that happened. And some days that 3-year period seems to me infuriatingly long. But today the change feels really exciting to me, and it feels indicative of so much more potential. By now, most of us do know whose land we're on, and many of you I see are sharing that in the chat. If you don't yet know, you can use this resource. I hope the link will, it's not working as a link, but you can copy paste. Native Land Digital is a resource to use. And so there are a lot of double negatives in this thought, so I hope that it comes across clearly, but I'm sitting here wondering, in another 3 years, what practice or truth, what more just and loving reality of how we relate to one another and how we relate to the land and the air and the water and what might possibly feel so normal that we barely remember days when we only did land acknowledgements at the beginning of events. I'm sitting here thinking, what can I imagine and how can I make it so? And I didn't even mean to land here, and now it feels almost cliche, but queer communities and especially trans communities have always moved whole societies forward through radical imagination and risking their lives to manifest that radical imagination. So I'm so honored tonight to welcome Michelle Esther O'Brien to share with us the work of the New York City Trans Oral History Project and to expand our thinking and imagination around oral history methodology. A really wonderful sort of end to this great season that we've had in the fall so far. Michelle spent 3.5 years leading the NYC TOHP as the Community Oral History Coordinator at the New York Public Library. She's currently a psychotherapist in private practice, and she recently completed her PhD in sociology at New York University. Congratulations. Her dissertation considered how capitalism shapes LGBTQ social movements in New York City. Her full and really amazing bio is on our event page. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I have a PowerPoint or Google slide presentation. It's not very fancy, and my talk isn't very polished. I didn't write it up, so I'm going to ramble at you all for a little while, and hopefully not too long, so we have a lot of time for discussion. And this is only a slightly expanded version of a talk that I gave at the center, the LGBTQ Community Center in New York City, hosted by the Oral History Summer School last fall, I guess, before the pandemic, that I gave with Nico Fuentes, who helped me a lot in sort of trying to think through these issues, as have the other active participants and members of the New York City Trans Oral History Project. And I know one or two people here overlap from that event, and then a lot of you overlap from the class that I spoke in recently. So my apologies for repetition. Okay, so I'll share my screen and give it a shot. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the New York City Trans Oral History Project that I work with, and a little bit at the end try to extrapolate or elaborate on some of the ways that we've made unconventional decisions that differ from some of oral history orthodoxy or methodology. And I hope I'm not too provocative in doing so. Start off, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Then I will tell you about the Trans Oral History Project, the New York City Trans Oral History Project. And I'm going to play a clip from the interview with Cecilia Gentili, and then tell you a little bit about some of the decisions we made in the project design and in our practice since then that have made us unusual. And then hopefully we will have a lot of time for discussion. So start off about myself. So I am trans. Have done political community work for a very long time, for 20 some years. I came out a long time ago, which in trans world is not that typical. And I have been a part of trans work in Philadelphia and in New York for quite a while. And I have done a variety of different kinds of organizing. And I started as a part-time, 1 day a week staff person with the New York City Trans Oral History Project in 2000, I can't remember. But I finished up. I left the position 6 months ago after 3.5 years, so you can do the math. And my position, I've been replaced by Sebastian Castro Nicolescu, who's just started and has been a part of the collective for a long time and is going to do really fantastic work that I'm very excited about. As mentioned, I just finished a PhD that I was doing while working on the Trans Oral History Project, and then became a psychotherapist. Previously, I'd been a social worker for some time. And so I brought to the project sort of my deep political commitments, my deep political connections, my personal connections to trans life, but also this sort of lens of thinking as a social scientist, really interested in trying to make sense of the social mechanics of social movements and anti-trans oppression. And then the project sort of led me increasingly into thinking about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thinking. The transformative experience that I had around listening to people was very moving to me. And that's a lot of what we talked about in the class, but people are welcome to ask about it. I'll talk about it just a little bit at the end. Okay, so I'm going to read you our mission statement. It's quite long. I'll read it slowly and sort of elaborate on it. And it's really integral to it. We really believe that all of our decisions as a project is motivated by our underlying mission. And that many of the unconventional decisions we've made about how to organize our, decisions we made about how to design our project have been driven by a sense of how the project could be useful to communities, how it could serve people's political movements, cultural projects, expressive projects, and how it can be a part of a broader struggle in New York to transform the city and transform the world, as we believe that trans life has always done and has the potential to do. So the mission statement is unusually important in that regard, more so than it might be for some work. We sort of think about it a lot. So we are a collective community archive working to document transgender resistance and resilience in New York City. So we are a collective, we are an independent collective. We've partnered with the New York Public Library, who hosts the archive and pays the 1 day a week staff position, but its vast majority of it is volunteer labor. So we work to confront the erasure of trans lives and to record the diverse history of gender as intersecting with race and racism, poverty, disability, aging, housing, migration, sexism, and the AIDS crisis. So racial justice, economic justice, an analysis around the dynamics of racialized poverty and the reality of racialized poverty for trans people is really central to our thinking and our commitments and to the archive that we ended up building. We privilege the insights of vulnerable trans communities, fighting the structural dismantling of public benefits, housing insecurity and homelessness, policing, and surveillance. Okay, so we post public recorded interviews with trans New Yorkers and also welcome new contributions from volunteer interviewers and narrators. So I'm going to talk more about this, sort of our analysis and our thinking around volunteer interviewers. Anyone who identifies as trans, gender nonconforming, trans or gender nonconforming, and as a sometime resident of New York City is invited to contribute an interview. All interviews are accessible to the public and part of the Creative Commons license for free and open use. So that's a good, remarkably good introduction to us. So we are institutionally independent. The New York Public Library sort of hosts the archive, but we have always functioned as a collective independently of that. The archive is currently down because while the position was unstaffed, the New York Public Library took it down as part of a migration into a new platform that has been needed for several years. And it's very good it's happening, but it shouldn't have been taken down during that. Now that we have a new staff person there, hopefully she will be able to advocate for getting it back up quickly. When I started in the project I guess it was 2016, January 2016, there was one interview posted. Now there are 190 interviews posted, and 160 of them have been transcribed by volunteers, overwhelmingly by volunteers. Interviews generally are about an hour and a half and usually follow the arc of the narrator's life, but we definitely don't constrain that. We really encourage people to approach oral history in a way that isn't just a life course interview. If people want to spend the whole time talking about their art or their writing or their activism or their lousy jobs or whatever it is, we strongly encourage that. We are overwhelmingly volunteer driven. The 6-hour-a-week staff person is the extent of our staffing. So the vast majority of our interviews are done by volunteers, and the vast majority of our organizing and programming work, we have a few events a year, both trainings, but also public events and panels are all volunteer organized. And our collective are made up of volunteers. So we have 2 websites, an archive page hosted by the New York Public Library that's currently down, and a collective page. So this is what the archive looks like when it was up. Just to sort of give you a glimpse, these are the A's, A-B to A-S. And you click on any of these and are taken to the person's interview that's tagged. We have summaries, usually written by volunteers or the interviewer, and you can search through a variety of cross-references. And what the new platform is going to enable is being one much more long-term. This particular platform was made as a one-time thing, and that creates a lot of problems in terms of institutional maintenance. So the new platform will be integrated into the New York Public Library's main digital collections, and it will also mean that it's much more searchable as part of the library's overall archive. But this gives you a sense of the archive page. And then this is a collective website, which is still up and includes our handbook that a long, rich, wonderfully done PDF document that has all our advice for interviewers and really is designed to enable people to be able to take on being interviewers. So it's very little previous experience. So I'm going to play, to give you a sense, I'm going to play you a clip from Cecilia Gentili. So Cecilia Gentili, when I met her, she was the director of policy at Gay Men's Health Crisis, actually a department that I had worked in 10 years prior as a community organizer. Cecilia left that job since we did the interview, and she's doing a lot of things these days, performance art and consulting and other things. You should hire her as a consultant. But she devoted a huge amount of time to leading New York's campaign to decriminalize sex work, both because of her own experience as a sex worker and then recognizing how central sex work is for the survival economies of many trans women of color in New York City. And that during her time at GMHC, decriminalizing sex work was a little too much for them to handle as a thing to prioritize. So she left her job and has been really prioritizing this. And what they do is organize sex workers to gather stories, to document the enormous harm caused by the anti-sex work laws in New York City, the enormous harm to sex workers, and as part of a broader struggle of improving trans women of color's lives, trying to decriminalize sex work. So it's a trans BIPOC-led campaign that includes many, many different types of sex workers and some of the more exciting policy organizing that was happening in New York City. So Cecilia grew up in Argentina during the dictatorship, and this particular point of the interview comes just after she talked about a pretty awful experience at the tail end of it, of being disciplined for using the girls' bathroom and then sort of showing her pictures of genitalia and telling her which genitalia was hers, and based on that, which bathroom she was allowed to use. And as she says, she thought they were crazy. And this leads into an entirely different story. And it's a 6-minute clip. So part of playing this is us having the experience of listening, which is so central to oral history work and certainly our commitments. And I hope this works.
This is where what boys have. And that's why it was a boys' bathroom to go to. And that's the bathroom that I should go to. And that I shouldn't go to the girls' bathroom anymore. And I thought like they were crazy. I thought like they were absolutely crazy. They were absolutely crazy. It is also other parts of the story. Like the area that I live as a child in Argentina was known as an area where it was UFO activities. So like people would find like, you know, in the cornfields, they would find like the, you know, those marks and things like that. So I remember like, you know, jumping on my bike and going, trying to find, you know, if there was any UFO activities or things like that. And one time driving to my grandmother's house with my brother in a very dark night, we went through a railroad. And my brother told me, I have something to tell you. And I said, what is it? And he said, like, yeah, but you have to promise me that you're not going to tell mom or dad about this because they don't like to talk about this. And I said, what happened? He said, did you see that railroad that we just passed? And I said, yes. And he said, that's where we found you 5 years ago. And I said, like, what do you mean you found me? Yeah, you were there. And I'm like, but how? And he said, well, you were a baby. And I said, like, was I in a basket? He said, no basket. I said, like, was I in a blanket, wrapped in a blanket? And he said, no, you were there naked. And I started crying. He said, don't cry, but you know, I just want you to know that you are not our family, that you were found. So during the rest of the trip to my grandma's house, I put two and two together. And I thought, this is an area with a lot of UFO activities. I am a girl with a fucking dick. And I was found there. I know what happened here. I was left by mistake by a UFO. And I thought like somewhere it would be a planet where all girls could have penises like me. And for me, it was kind of I think I always found magical ways to deal with reality. And I told that to my grandmother, who totally entertained the idea. And we waited for a couple of nights to see if any UFO would come back to get me. And she was ready to let me go back there. And she waited with me until late at night and helped me prepare a little backpack in case that they would come to rescue me. And I thought like that was so cool that she did that.
Very sweet. Were you ever able to confirm if your brother was telling the truth or not?
Well, my mom said that is not, and is also, she also tells stories about how difficult it was to be in labor in a hot,
yeah.
hot January summer, and me being in labor with me for like 2 days. And her story is very consistent on like she gave birth to me. So I think that he was just being a horrible older brother, which that's what people do, right? That's what older brothers do. I don't know because I don't have a younger sibling, but I will never know what the experience of being an older brother is. But my brother was just awful like that, which I think is so funny right now. But at the time, it was horrible.
What was the political context in Argentina like at the time?
Terrible.
Yeah, I've heard a bit about it.
It was a terrible moment. It was one of the worst dictatorships. My family, parts of my family were more involved in politics. And because of that, that was a conversation that was always on the table. But most of the people didn't really know what was happening, didn't really know that people were being kidnapped and killed, and pregnant people were being kidnapped, and their children were like stolen from them, and then those they were killed, and those children were like sold, and like, and everything that was not totally aligned with the dictators and the dictatorship that was going on was simply eliminated. It was no way to kind of work with them.
So I love this interview. I love Cecilia. She's emceed many of the Trans Oral History Project's events and has been a huge ally to our project. And the interview is just filled with so much rich material. I highly recommend listening to it when it goes back up online. A lot of it is about her time in drug addiction and living around the United States, and yeah, getting into the work that she does. This particular clip is so interesting on so many different levels. So obviously it really links her personal experience, her family, and the political context, right, of military dictatorship. And she goes on to talk about being a trans sex worker in a major city in Argentina during the dictatorship and what that was like. And then the transition to democracy not leading to trans people being treated any differently at all, because I mean, the police were still transphobic, they were still violent, and as Cecilia says, the mentality of dictatorship stays with people. But there's another link here, which is very striking for me, sort of thinking about it psychoanalytically. So the family romance is a fantasy that a lot of people have, a term for a fantasy that your parents not really your parents. You belong to some other family. You belong to some other world. And you ended up in this world, this awful world, as a mistake, right? And a lot of people have this fantasy. People grow up reading fantasy novels and science fiction and other things. Some people have it quite seriously. Lots of trans people have it, right? Like, the world we live in is wrong. Either our bodies are wrong, our expectations other people put on us are wrong, the family structure and its logic is wrong. So the family romance is very compelling to lots of trans people. And here Cecilia has this beautiful, remarkable, interesting version of it, of like, she's an alien. And I have spent a lot of my life feeling like I'm not quite human. I find that very compelling. Like, there's a huge overlap between science fiction fans and trans people that isn't very written about very much, but lots of like Trekkies in our archive and stuff like that. People writing science fiction, you know, there's a lot of that. And then, and her grandmother is so beautiful, right? Taking her out to the desert with a backpack and like supporting her fantasy as an ally to her, as like getting her difficulties on some level, on a profound level. And then it segues to the military dictatorship. And there's a lot you could say about the Argentine military dictatorship. I read 2 books about it. I know something about it. I didn't know what Cecilia chose to focus on, which was when they killed political activists, they would sell their children to the families of military officials, which is the same story, right? Of like displacing a child out of one context into another one. I had never heard that. And it's so interesting to me that Cecilia chose to focus on that part of the vast brutality of the military dictatorship and the horrific, you know, they killed, I think, over 100,000 people. I mean, it was like so horrific. And this story of like stealing children, and that's something, you know, like there's a lot there. There's so much there. And I think those sort of links, those deep links, are there when people are telling their stories in a free, less directed way. Like, you can see it unravel, you can see it unfolding, you know, these connections. Anyhow, so A little bit about what makes us unusual. So we are a strongly mission-driven project. We have a strong political analysis rooted in racial and economic justice, which is different than some oral history projects that we've seen. Not all, of course. Anyone can conduct interviews for the project. We don't connect narrators and interviewers. We encourage people to interview trans people in their own lives and their own networks, and that provides some support and some protection in that there's a shared context, sometimes a shared language that people are interviewing, that people share in these conversations, often people interviewing people they know. And that means that there's often very little training. We do trainings every year, but they're not required at all. And our handbook has some advice, but like mostly people go out in the field untrained. And we really believe in that. Like we recognize that there are vast, rich skills to be developed as oral historians. We certainly have seen our own skills developed, but we really believe in trying to make conducting oral history as broad as possible. And some oral history projects have really moved away from I think the historical legacy of it being a really inclusive thing towards being a more specialized, more professionalized, requiring more education and more training to be able to do it. And this is probably the most unusual thing. Our interviews are entirely public. They're posted Creative Commons, and anyone can use them for basically anything. It's a Creative Commons 1 license, which means that somebody could take the interviews and make money off of them and incorporate them in things with no one's permission at all. In the 4 years that the project has been running, that hasn't happened. The interviews have been used in many, many, many different ways and incorporating them in many projects, but every use that we have ever seen, people got additional non-legal permission from the narrators and usually paid them money in the process. Almost always paid them money. I helped edit a gay communist magazine called Pinko, and we did one about working retail of a collection of interviews, a previous one about sex work, where it's excerpts out of interviews, and everyone, we are a very low budget project, but we paid all the people who agreed to have their interviews included. And we've seen many, many examples of people sort of taking up the interviews in a variety of ways, but that is not legally binding. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is a really core part of how we design the project. Okay. So rethinking oral history methodology. So a lot of trans stories, stories about trans people are generated by medical institutions, by legal institutions. There's a huge amount of material out there about trans life. And part of our thinking, part of our effort, my apologies, there's so much text on this slide. I don't like to do slides like this, but I'm going to talk for a while on this. Part of our thinking is really trying to figure out how to enable a different kind of story and a different kind of relationship between the story and storytellers and listeners than what we see in the vast medical records about trans life. And one of the things that we believe that has been argued by some smart folks is that actually this sort of like medical apparatus that generates a particular kind of stories about people's lives is maintained by some oral historians and by some university oral historians, that some of the institutional practices that shape telling the stories of marginalized people have incorporated themselves subtly into oral history practices, even when their adherents reject the oppression of that history. And particularly, we see this in some of the paternalism around trans stories. So as a university researcher, you get IRB approval to interview human subjects. Oral historians are supposed to be are sometimes exempt from having to do that because they don't develop systematic knowledge out of the interviews, which is pretty absurd. And then, there's this university oversight of trans stories and trans people are often sort of considered a vulnerable population, not according to national criteria, but many universities do. And so there's this enormous amount of anxiety about hurting people in that's incorporated the protection of people into how oral history is done. And we are very skeptical of this. We think a huge part of this, and this is tied up with legal liability, is driven by institutions trying to minimize the threat of being sued and not actually driven by an honest assessment of what the risks are or what could protect them. So one example of that is supposedly copyright keeps your story from being able to be used by somebody you don't give approval to because you own the copyright of your story, right? Supposedly. That's, for poor people, that's pretty ridiculous. Like, suing someone over copyright is not that realistic unless there's a giant amount of money involved. Like that kind of like institutional protection of copyright, we assess doesn't meaningfully protect trans people at all. It just doesn't. And that this sort of apparatus of paternalism does much more to restrict the access and use of trans stories gathered into archives and prevents trans people from being able to access them, prevents trans people from being able to use them, and keeps them in the hands of researchers who know how to navigate these systems, and that the systems that are supposed to protect narrators are actually there to protect the institutions. Yeah. So this is reflected in our approach of copyright and ownership, that we, because so many people we interview, we are not able to reach later. People die. Many people in our archive have passed away. People disappear. People get incarcerated. People are very hard to reach. So that's one whole reality. And then there's lots and lots of ways people might be okay with their interviews being used, but not be able to sign forms, get signed documents in. People sign releases when they first do an interview. And this is assessing this has really led us to think the way to make our interviews accessible to non-academics and usable to non-academics is by making them Creative Commons. And we really stand by that. We've really been happy with it. And that ultimately it's trans people themselves who are in the best position of assessing what they're comfortable sharing and what they're not. And people know there are risks. There are a lot of risks. I mean, I have been targeted by fascist, transphobic feminists who've threatened me and my child and my family. Like, there are many, many risks with being public. And that trans people have made that choice in large numbers. When the Trump administration rolled back the sort of definition of trans people, or it got leaked, the Health and Human Services was doing that, we saw an uptick in the number of people that wanted to share their stories, right? That I think one of the things that's happening is trans people being much more bold in being out there and willing to take risks and assessing those risks for themselves. So also, we really care about expanding the access of conducting oral histories, really believing that not only can anyone share their story, but anyone can do interviews. And particularly within marginalized communities, we're really interested in the dynamic of people interviewing each other. And then the other unconventional thing that we do is we have a very small budget. We have very little money, but whenever the collective is able to raise money at all, mostly what we do is pay narrators. And, a very small percentage of our narrators are paid, probably only 30 out of 190 or so. And the way we connected with them is that they were referred or active members in BIPOC-led trans organizing in New York City. So we collaborated with community-based organizations, and then they identified people that they thought would really have a powerful story to share. And so that's about moving money into these organizations, moving money into these communities, and really seeing the reality of intense social marginalization and a sort of people are often subject to a high level of academic research in working class trans communities. I think largely because of HIV and AIDS risks, but there are other reasons as well. So many people have been approached by academics wanting to learn about their lives, and recognizing that reality, we have been really committed to trying to raise money and distribute that to people. And the New York Public Library has never participated in that, as most institutions would have a lot of hesitancy around doing so, for reasons that ultimately we're critical of, even if we share some of them. So a couple of things that have informed a little bit of my thinking. One is AJ Lewis of the New York City Trans Oral History Project. I really want to give a shout out to, who spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff and sort of helped us develop our analysis around it, that we fleshed out over time. And then one of the published pieces that I think begins to get at some of these issues is a piece by Franklin called Calculating Risk. And so it's an academic essay out there that talks some about the limits and contradictions of the IRB in thinking about it in the history of medicalized trans narratives. So there are also many ways that we maintain oral history methodology and really see it informing our work very deeply. I think oral history is really extraordinary for its commitment, broad, recognized commitment that everybody has a story to tell, that you don't have to be a special, famous person to have a story that's really worth documenting and worth listening to. That we draw from oral history as a tradition and as a method in being committed to doing bottom-up, community-based history. And we're really interested in oral history methods and have learned a lot from other oral historians about how to open up the space for people to be able to say something new and unexpected in interviews. And I've learned a lot that has sort of helped guide me into thinking, into being interested in psychoanalysis, which I've been on the periphery of for a long time, but really dove into after I left my staff position with the project, that both listening and speaking can be really very powerful transformative experiences. And that's really linked to sort of what happens in a space when people start saying something unexpected. And I've learned so much from oral historians across a number of different projects about this sort of space of creative, transformative, and novel listening. So we're very indebted to that and very interested in that. So I think that's my presentation. So yeah, I was I hope I probably talked very fast. If you want me to repeat anything, that's fine. But I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion because I know there are a number of esteemed and remarkable both oral historians and LGBTQ community historians here, and many people who have considerably more experience in LGBTQ studies or oral history than I do. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion. And if you want me to repeat anything, I'm happy to, or elaborate on anything. I welcome that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really wonderful. There's already a question in the chat, so I'll read that out in just a moment in case folks are only calling in. And then sort of for the rest of the Q&A, usually we open it up, and if folks want to voice their questions, we invite you to unmute. I will just sort of point out that if Michelle decides to post the recording publicly, our sort of standard at OMA is to edit out sort of audience participation verbally and your picture and stuff just for your own privacy. But what we've been doing the last couple sessions, or y'all have been doing, is just mostly putting your questions in the chat, and then I've been reading those out. So if they're in the chat and we read them out, they can end up online, but if you want to voice your question, that's totally fine as well. The first question that's already in here, Michelle, is from Maria. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. Are people allowed to change their mind about participating? Can they have their narrative removed from the archive? Asking as I'm embarking with a collective on a participatory oral history project.
So we strongly believe in the necessity of enabling takedown requests. And I would field about one a month people would start looking for jobs and realize they talked about their genitalia or, all sorts of other situations. And our interviews are quite public. They are accessible to Google, as are the transcripts. And so takedown requests were pretty routine, and we took them very seriously. And during the staffing transition, when we realized there weren't going to be any staff, we really insisted that the New York Public Library develop an official protocol around takedown requests, and that if we couldn't get them to commit to keeping the archive up, but we managed. I mean, they will put it back up, I'm sure, but they absolutely continued to field takedown requests during the no staff in the position. That was the one thing that they stayed on top of. And given the sort of vulnerabilities and risks involved in people being able to assess that, we really saw that as just so essential. And now, thankfully, we have a sort of formal takedown request policy that will be instituted for the extended future of the archive.
Thank you for sharing about that. Yeah. Someone asked also how to get a recorded version of this event, which I do just want to clarify. So we are recording as usual for just in case. And then Michelle and I will have the conversation later on about whether or not to share the recording more publicly, if to clip it or post the whole thing, that kind of process. Same with our interviews, we save that conversation for after Michelle has shared whatever she wants, rather than having it determined ahead of time. So that's just kind of how that'll operate. And then we'll post it on our event page. Kay asked in the chat, Michelle, can you talk about how oral history can or cannot be a form of community organizing? How are they the same or different working together? Or how are they the same or different or working together?
So obviously there's an element of community organizing just in keeping the project going, right? We have meetings, we have planning retreats, we have panels, we have a sort of orbit, a large orbit of volunteers, active volunteers. We have lots of people who are community leaders who are sympathetic to the project and speak positively of it. All of this is community organizing and requires community organizing in order to function. And we are one of like a number, many trans-led projects in New York City that people know about and people care about and people support. So there's that piece. I'm really interested. I mean, I worked as an organizer, working on policy campaigns, trying to change state law and building power amongst poor people. And I'm really interested in how our project could help that. So, I think we have only done so to a limited extent. One example is that I interviewed a bunch of people who are involved in some unionization campaigns at their workplace that was trans-led, and it was a really interesting campaign. And that both these people and their labor union were very excited to get this public archive as part of trying to push a broader discussion around trans people in the labor movement. And a number of the people that I interviewed and I ended up going to Labor Notes, a biannual leftist labor organizing conference in Chicago, and having a lot of workshops and conversations with people trying to make their unions more trans inclusive, trying to use their unions to fight around anti-trans discrimination in their workplaces, trying to expand unionization in the sectors that have a concentration of trans workers. And that this is really exciting work that we saw our oral histories as in direct service to and directly useful. We have a lot of visions of how that could be expanded. So like Decrim New York, for example, gathered all these testimonies from sex workers who went to Albany to testify to their legislators about their experiences of police brutality and police harassment. And then the bill didn't pass, and they're going to have to do it all again in a couple of years when the next time it comes up. And like creating an archive that could be incorporated into policy papers and organizing campaigns, we're really, really interested in how that could happen. And into power building in all its many, many forms, not just Albany legislative stuff, but the many other kinds of organizing that trans people are doing, figuring out how our project could be directly help people and be a tool in people's struggles.
Thank you. There's another question here from Sarah. Hi, Sarah, by the way. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Can you talk about whether or how your mission and approach impact the transcription process? For example, who is transcribing the interviews? I know, volunteers, but sort of who are they? What guidance are they given or not given? Whether the transcripts are edited, by whom, that whole process?
Transcripts are mostly generated by undergraduate LGBT history students whose teachers assign them generating a transcript as a required final project. And 3 instructors have done this. One has done it repeatedly, Molly Gray at Portland State University in Oregon. But Amanda Armstrong Price did so at Fordham, and a couple of other people have. And so those are most of our transcriptions, which is pretty amazing to me. And they report it being a really transformative experience to listen over and over and over again, listen very deeply to this material. And the teachers love it. The students end up liking it a lot. We've gotten a lot of volunteers once people finish their class. They really want to continue transcribing. They're really interested in it as an experience. We give some sort of procedural training and sort of style guide, but we don't do a lot of sort of trans education. And there's a decent chunk of transcriptions, I'd say 1 in 10, that we basically have to toss out because somebody is quite confused about some basic things about trans. They're not a transliterate person. And that's fine, 1 in 10 is fine. We don't mind. We reassign it to another student next semester. So, definitely some level of supervision is important there. We absolutely do not have narrators read over and approve their transcript. We're interested in kind of the spontaneous quality of what people are shared. We're interested in, it would be logistically enormously arduous for such a volunteer-driven project. We've had 2 or 3 interviews that were conducted under some other auspices where the person had to approve their interview and the transcript. And those interviews never went up. It was just a multi-month, brutal, labor-intensive process that we never made it through. And all power to people who are able to figure out how to do that. That's great. But I think that would make the interviews much worse. And 2, it would just be impossible for us. And that means probably slightly more takedown requests and slightly more self-editing when people are being interviewed. And that's fun. People avoid certain topics because they don't want it on the internet. And we totally support that. And many people just don't want to be interviewed under these conditions. And that's fine too. That the value of a public archive, having it be people that feel comfortable sharing something is what our goal is. I put some work into the transcripts, all having a consistent formatting and consistent numbering system so that one day someone can cite them all together and they can be indexed all together as a body. They're 30 pages each, 160 of them, as this huge collection of trans history. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. I'm a transcription nerd, so have so many follow-ups about that in particular, but I'll return to the chat here because there are a lot of other questions coming in here. Marcos and Lauren are asking respectively about sort of intersections between trans history and immigration in one case, and trans history, sorry, I've misread Lauren's question. Marcos is asking about immigration and trans history, that intersection, and Lauren's asking about oral history and women's studies, the intersection there. I don't know if you want to talk in between those 2 intersections or take them one at a time, but those are both in the mix.
And are the questions are they about anything specific?
Sure, I'll just read them out. I always try to decide if I'm gonna like paraphrase along the way, and it never ends well. I should just read from the beginning. Marcos asks, can you talk about the relation between immigration and the transgender experience in New York, and maybe how an oral history project can document these people and their life histories that usually are not registered? And then Lauren asks, how do you believe oral history methodology and women's studies tie into one another?
So about immigration, we are very interested in migration stories. And in the US context, or in many contexts, migration often refers to across national borders. We have a substantial number of interviews with Latinx migrants. And we have a chunk of interviews, 9, I think, in Spanish, and really are interested in interviews that are not in English. We have a fair number of bilingual interviews as well that go back and forth between multiple languages. In New York, trans communities have been really deeply shaped by histories of transnational migration, are a really huge part of trans life. There's another kind of migration within national borders that is also very interesting. So New York's working class is really profoundly shaped by the displacement of people off of in often very brutal, horrifically brutal agricultural labor in Puerto Rico and the American South. So Puerto Rican migrants, as Puerto Rican agriculture was being restructured, and then Black migrants as both Jim Crow was being dismantled, but the cotton industry collapsed, and a huge transformation of Southern rural life. So this big inflow that created the multiracial working class of New York prior to the big wave of international migration after the 1960s. And we see these stories happen all the time, where Black narrators talk about growing up in the Bronx and going to visit family in Atlanta or Tennessee or Mississippi. Kiara's from Beaumont, Texas. Like there's a deep link for many Black New Yorkers with the American South that's still very, very, very strong. It's also interesting, even amongst middle-class narrators, there's so many people move to New York because of a certain kind of fantasy of what the city offers. People move here to work in because they're interested in fashion, because they're interested in art, because they're interested in trans life in manifold ways. A lot of the people I interviewed who work in retail moved to the city because they're interested in fashion and ended up in retail via apparel. And that kind of trajectory is really interesting to me. And it's a cross-class experience. Some people come here go to fashion school that they are very comfortable at, and some people come to try to hustle and figure out how to make a life with very few resources and very little support. So that all is very fascinating to me. I would say where our our archive is very weak is in non-Latinx migration stories. So there are giant numbers of people from Asia that live in New York, a decent number of Africans. There are a lot of other people in New York who we just don't have that many interviews with. And that's something that was one of my goals for if we fundraised another $3,000 or whatever, to put it towards interviews with Chinese and Korean trans communities, and they exist, and I know very little about them. I have friends who pass in and out of them, but I know very little about it, and they're not well documented. And even having a bunch of interviews that are in Korean would be incredibly exciting to have in the archive, but that we haven't gotten there yet. In terms of women's studies, the extent to which trans studies functions in the academy, it functions within the sort of broader umbrellas of American studies and women's studies. If you had to go to a national disciplinary conference as a trans studies academic, that's where you would end up. And as someone who does queer studies and trans studies as a social scientist, strangely, I'm not particularly welcome there. It's a little weird, but those are really humanities fields. And the gap between people who study queer life as social scientists and people that write about it in the humanities is bizarrely vast for reasons that I don't fully understand. That are historical, but but you know, a lot of people who work in trans studies, who write about trans life, the extent to which they're academics, they end up in women's studies departments. And you know, there's a lot more to say there about one what I would focus on in sort of thinking about the dynamics of that is how much these academic departments were created by these massive working class rebellions in the 1960s and early 1970s. There were the universities, you know, really under attack from student rebellion, trying to transform them. And these departments were sort of small victories of these movements, and that very quickly veered away from actually being linked to those movements in a meaningful way. And that sort of the very difficult task of academics is figuring out how to rebuild those relationships, and that everything about how universities are organized undermines that. And the times where it becomes really possible to rebuild those relationships between movements and academics usually are when large numbers of working class college students join in popular rebellions, as happened with Black college students during the recent Black Lives Matter uprisings, which I think helped really transform things in some universities, not in the profound ways that needed to happen, but started things moving more dynamically, so that it's not just rhetoric, right? It's not just like writing about people, but it's actually participating in a transformation.
I'm nodding a lot. I really appreciate that answer. I'm seeing there are a lot of sort of extensive questions in the chat, and I'm just kind of catching up on those because I was like so focused on what you were saying there. And feel free to, Michelle, if you're looking at the chat, to choose one. But I'm noticing Rochelle's question in particular. Rochelle says, I'm learning about photo voice and autoethnographies/ethnographies as research methods and trying to advocate for their inclusion in family communication textbooks and curriculum design at my university. Do you think these trans oral histories can influence theory creation and ultimately impact society and social justice through academia? What is the best argument I can make for taking knowledge in this form seriously? And then additional resources if you have them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a chapter in my dissertation drawing from oral history work, and I sort of tried to include a defense of using oral histories in social science. And it was hard going. Like, I made the argument, but like I couldn't find very much stuff to cite. And I'm really frown on to what extent oral historians have sort of allowed this vast gulf between oral history work and trying to develop social theory. And like social theory is mostly supposedly done by academics. What social movements do, which is actual social theory, is not usually called that, unfortunately. But I mean, it's not that oral historians have to be in dialogue with academics more, but I think the way that IRB is structured and some of the ways that exemptions for the IRB work have really discouraged oral historians from thinking very much about relationships to social science and social theory in a way that I think is not helpful. I mean, avoiding academics is fine, but if you're going to be in an academic world, sort of embedding exclusively in the humanities, I think is unfortunate in some ways, despite all the wonderful things that people in the humanities do. And so I think we've let sort of institutional expectations sort of sever this. And then another thing that I've observed that I don't fully understand is that so many oral historians, when they're in dialogue about method and whatnot, they're in dialogue with other oral historians. And like a lot of disciplines, they spend a lot of time trying to think about what is unique and special in their discipline. And sociologists do, everyone does this. And so they're like, oh, it's all about orality. And I have some things to say about that and can talk about it, but they're like, oh, we're different than other oral history or other histories because we do this listening thing. and like, I think sometimes that's helpful, but like, actually, we're all should do whatever we can to join a shared project of human emancipation that requires understanding how society works as part of its endeavors, right? And that's what social movements do, try to make sense of society in the process of trying to transform it. And that whatever academic work we generate should be in the service of people's emancipation and survival. And that what makes our discipline special is kind of profoundly irrelevant to that. Like, it's extremely relevant if you want to get published in a peer-reviewed journal, but like, we really have to keep our horizons bigger than that and our vision bigger than that. And like, sometimes what is unique and special about oral history has something very powerful to offer that conversation. And sometimes oral historians, what they have to offer is a bunch of transcripts of people talking about something really concrete that they're grappling with in their lives that is not well documented elsewhere. And where it has nothing to do with oral history, it has to do with like the knowledge that people are generating in their own lives, in their own practices. I don't remember how I got on that tangent, but in any case.
It's amazing. I'm seeing a lot of other fired up faces out there, and some in the chat as well. Yes. I want to loop back now to a question that Kay posed earlier. We've been talking about the relationship between oral history and the sort of academia land. Kay asked about the relationship between the collective and the library. Their question reads, can you talk more about the relationship between the collective and NYPL? What has worked well and what hasn't? Kay is a librarian, by the way, so has a vested interest in this question. Actually, I'll read out your parenthetical as well. I'm a librarian who has worked for a public library and experienced what public libraries tend to think is neutral or fundable. So adding that language in the mix as well.
Yeah, so I'm certainly, like, mostly we were left alone to do what we wanted. And the library would sort of provide money in only extremely restricted conditions. And then they provided the archive. And there wasn't a lot of intervention. And right now there's actually a bit of a struggle happening around what authority the library has and what authority the collective has. And we're trying to figure that out, and it's not simple. And I certainly appreciate the support of the library. I believe in having an institutional partner as being really essential for the preservation of the archive. So that I think people would be really horrified if they learned that they shared their interviews and in 4 years' time, they were inaccessible to anyone. And I'm very skeptical of projects using privately owned, large-scale platforms like YouTube as their mode of preservation. And I don't believe that sort of community-based collectives, I mean, I study a lot of collectives from the 60s, from the 80s, from the 90s, and they don't exist anymore with rare exception. So it's very difficult for collectives to reproduce themselves over long periods of time. And like, I think the archive will be crucially needed in 50 years' time. Like, I actually really believe that. And so we need an institution that will exist in 50 years' time, with a great deal of social tumult that's going to happen between now and then. Like, things are going to get much, much worse. And so, that means universities, libraries, a handful of other kinds of institutions that reproduce themselves over long periods of time, and that there are a lot of problems with how much this work is embedded in universities. So doing it within a public library really made sense to us. In terms of fundable, the New York Public Library is particularly charged around questions of fundable because it's so much tied up with private fundraising from wealthy individuals in New York, which is a whole, I mean, one of the chapters of my dissertation is about how wealthy gay donors have shaped the LGBTQ organizing movements of New York City in profound and deep ways that like we don't really talk about. Like the whole world of donors is really incredible and quite frightening, you know, that shapes so much of the work we're able to do, because it takes money to do most kinds of work. And I think the library's a good compromise, NYPL. I think they're a good partner. I'm glad we work with them. I'm glad we have that partnership. There isn't any other institution I would have preferred. And it's not easy. Like they have not, like, for example, they've never written a grant on our behalf once.
Hannah has a sort of more specific question in here, shifting gears just a little bit. Hannah asks, how do you navigate the legal risk of interviewing sex workers, especially with yours being a collective project with untrained volunteers doing interviews? How do you address privacy and risk? Hannah has been struggling with that in a public oral history project, especially with narrators who live and work in small communities.
Yeah, no, this is huge. And I imagine that ultimately a sex work oral history project might be anonymized to significantly expand the people that can participate. So in terms of people being untrained, I think being a part of a shared community with somebody where there's a pre-existing relationship of some sort, even if it's secondhand, that led the narrator to choose to share their story with this person is a better protection than almost any training we can provide. Like, if we wanted to hire somebody to train a group of random young queers about sex work sensitivity, like, we'd be really, I mean, we would know who to hire, but like, it would be really hard. But because people are interviewing people they know, I think that creates a support. So all of our interviews about sex work were either done by me or one other collective member who's been around sex work for a long, long time. I happen to have not been a sex worker, but for a good decade of my life, I was literally the only trans woman I've ever met who hadn't had to do sex work at some point. And I just hadn't, mostly because I'm butch and have a very hard time with men. But in any case, or they were done by sex workers. We have a bunch of interviews by non-binary sex workers interviewing other non-binary sex workers and trans sex workers. And it's very exciting. I will say that we have a bunch of interviews with sex workers where they don't mention sex work. And the interviews where people talk about sex work a lot, and we have a lot of those, are with people who have left sex work and now work in HIV and AIDS services. And there's a bunch of those. So there's this, and that's an unfortunate feature of having a very public archive. So we have a bunch of material about sex work by former sex workers, like Cecilia Gentili. And then we have a bunch of interviews with current sex workers where they're talking about their favorite books and their collective projects of some sort that they talk about in very coded, oblique ways that are hard to pin down. And yeah, talking about what they love about New York or whatever it is, and really leaving out sex work. And that works for them. And I think ultimately documenting the stories of current sex workers would require a somewhat different model than we have. And we'd be interested and excited to try to figure out how to do that if we had the opportunity.
Thank you for that. I'm seeing the time. I'm going to try to squeeze in two questions that I see as related that are both about oral history and space. Shahab and Ken are asking. Shahab says, how do you see these oral histories as tools for transformative public policies related to the design and use of urban spaces? Are there strong spatial linkages to these oral history narratives? And then Ken's sort of addition there is, let's see if I can find the question part of it. I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss the intersection of oral history and historic preservation, sort of asking about identifying sites of marginalized communities that are often very difficult to document for a multitude of reasons. How can oral histories work to include location-based information?
We have tons and tons of location-based interviews. We have tons of interviews of people talking about the years they spent living on the Chelsea Piers or in West Village. One of our first interviews, and we've added to it many times, is with Jay Chul, and it's multiple hours. And Jay talking about being incarcerated at the Women's House of Detention, which is now a beautiful ornate garden and a library, which was a courthouse before, and being tortured there, right? Like a really nightmarish place that housed lesbians, overwhelmingly lesbians, through the 50s and 60s and for the decades prior. And, we have lots and lots of interviews of people talking about particular neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx that are really integral for them. People talking about businesses, Lee Brewster's, where trans women and drag queens would go and buy supplies, people talking about clubs that they were very involved in or worked in. And so there's so much location stuff. And there's someone who has put a lot of work into sort of geocoding LGBTQ history sites around New York. And for a little while, there was an effort at collaborating with them around figuring out how to geocode our interviews. And all of that would just require someone really excited about working on it, sort of pouring in that energy over time. In terms of struggles about space, there's been a lot of struggles about space in New York over time. Some of them have been very tied up with trans communities. I think you can look at Stonewall as a struggle about space. Groups like Fierce sort of came out of the struggles around gentrification in the West Village. And I think our interviews have a lot to say about that. I don't think I can think of any examples of us sort of directly collaborating around those movements, but I'd be very excited if we ever did.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your sharing this amazing work with us. And I appreciate you all for being here. Thank you so much. It's great to see you. Michelle, I can stay on and field if you have time and want to take one last question, but if you have to run, that's totally fine.
Yeah, I can stay on for a couple more minutes, not too much longer. I want to give a shout out to Suzanne Snyder, who taught me a lot of what I know about how to conduct oral histories. So yeah, I can take one more question.
Okay, Sarah threw one in here towards the end there. Can you share more about your collective structure and perhaps its origin story?
We're trying to figure that out, our structure. But we have 2 retreats a year. We have monthly calls. Sort of the collective are more or less sort of the most active volunteers, the people sort of willing to be on calls. The collective makes the decisions about how to manage the project. People have sort of slightly different focuses within the collective. Some people sort of are more focused on the technical back-end stuff, some are more on the public programming, some more on the interviewing skills, sort of interview development. That isn't formal as a division. We've tried making it formal a couple of times without it quite working. But yeah, and the collective, a huge chunk of what it ends up doing is, and this is interesting, is not collecting most of the interviews and not managing the archives. But what the collective ends up doing is community-based collaborations. So we, collaborations with the Rikers Island Public Memory Project, collaborations with the New York Transgender Advocacy Group, collaborations with community-based organizations that are interested in using storytelling and documenting particular histories and organizing events together. And there have been many, many examples of that. And that's where a lot of the collective effort has been placed.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see your faces and see your rectangles. Michelle, thank you. Thank you. We hope to see many of you. Usually this is the time when I tell you when our next event is. It's TBD, so keep an eye out on the OMA mailing list or what have you for that announcement for the spring season. And if anyone wants to hang out and say hi, please feel free. I can stay on for a few minutes, but please join me in thanking Michelle again.